So firstly, welcome. Thank you very much for taking the future of your organisation into your own hands. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces online tonight. Thanks for joining us and coming to hear the ramblings of Steve Connolly again. To those of you who I don't know, thanks very much for joining us, and I hope to see you again in future throughout the series of training and education sessions that we'll be delivering in partnership with Moreton Bay Regional Council over the next couple of years. So firstly, really importantly to acknowledge the traditional owners, traditional custodians of the country where we walk, work, live and play. Moreton Bay Regional Council and CPR Group recognises the continuing connection to land, waters and culture that our traditional custodians have, and pay respects importantly to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to extend this respect specifically to any First Nations people who join us online this evening. And I'm joining you from the Sunshine Coast tonight, which is Kabi Kabi country. Tonight, as I touched on, is the first in a series of education and training sessions, some of which will be online, some of which may be in person, that will be provided at no cost by Moreton Bay Regional Council to community organisations right across the region. And tonight's workshop, importantly, complements a host of disaster resilience templates and resources that we're going to make available to you all from tomorrow. And I'll be sharing the link to that page where you'll be able to access all of those resources at the end of tonight's session. The recording of this session will also be made available over the next few days, and that'll be at the same link where you'll be able to access the resources from tomorrow morning. Speaking of which, as you will have seen from the little dialogue box that popped up when you joined the session, tonight's session is being recorded. So if you would prefer for your video not to appear on the recording, feel free to just turn your camera off, because the recording will have a little black box up in the top right-hand corner over in front of the presentation slides that, oh, sorry, I've just had to mute someone there, that will pop up if you speak. So if you'd prefer not to be seen in the recording, and indeed if you'd prefer not to have your voice heard either, then you can sit quietly, and any questions that you've got, you're more than welcome to contact us after the session in the coming days or weeks, and I'll provide contacts for both ourselves here at CPR Group as well as for the team at Moreton Bay Regional Council. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Steve Connolly. I'm the Director of Sport and Community Development with CPR Group, and we're a consultancy that has been working in the sport, recreation and community development space for a little over a quarter of a century. Head office is based here on the Sunshine Coast. We have staff in Moreton Bay, we have staff in Brisbane, we have staff in Logan. So we're kind of spread across this little southeast Queensland pocket. And we get a genuine kick out of helping the people such as yourselves who administer and govern not-for-profit community sport recreation organisations across the country. We're really fortunate to have been working alongside Moreton Bay Regional Council since amalgamation in 2008. And prior to that, with all three councils, Caboolture, Redcliffe and Pine Rivers. So we've got a long-standing working partnership with council, and we, at CPR Group, we used to think that our job was all about creating better businesses in the not-for-profit sector. What we've realised probably about 10 years ago now is that we're actually all about the people. We exist to create happy volunteers, happy not-for-profit staff who enjoy what they do. They spend the amount of time that they want to spend in their organisation or role from one week to the next. But maybe even more importantly than that, they spend all of their time in their organisation doing the stuff that they want to do. They don't get drawn into taking on job after job after job and get to the point of burnout, only to leave that organisation in a really difficult situation of trying to replace them, not with one person, but probably with, half a dozen. So, like I say, we exist to create happier people in not-for-profit organisations, and part of that certainly sits comfortably within the disaster resilience realm, because this, as Robin mentioned earlier in our discussion before we got into the formalities, there are some really stressful times that volunteers and staff such as yourselves in community organisations have to go through. And often when it comes to disasters, when your organisation is affected, you're affected at home as well. And often you're affected at work also. So this compounding nature of disaster impact can really take its toll. So it's important that, in our opinion, and certainly in Moreton Bay Regional Council's opinion, hence this program of support, that organisations do what they can outside the times of disaster, so that when disaster strikes, you're as best prepared as you can possibly be. So we've got a host of Moreton Bay Regional Council staff online. You heard from a few earlier. So we've got Chris Barnes, who is the Manager of Emergency Management and Public Safety with Council. We've got Kay Spear, who is the Sport and Recreation Manager. We've got Peter and Lee from the Sport and Recreation team, and we've got others from the team as well. So I really can't stress enough how important it is for organisations such as all of yours to be well connected with your council. Council is arguably your largest, most significant and important stakeholder. You might lease from them, you might seek financial support from them, you might attend sessions such as this. And I know that when I'm in a session like this, whether it's face-to-face or online, that I'm preaching to the converted. You know all of this, and that's why you're here. That's why you buy into programs provided by council such as this education program. But this session being recorded will also then be a bit of a legacy that you can share with others in your organisation, or people in other organisations that may be seeking support in the disaster resilience space. So like I mentioned, we'll deal with questions at the end. Don't feel as though you have to wait until the end to ask those questions. You can type your questions in to the chat field at any time. I'll keep a little bit of a watching brief on that throughout the session. When you see me look over this way, I'm looking at my screen where I can see what's going on in the Zoom room. But like I say, we'll allocate sufficient time at the end of the session. So our hard finish time is 8 p.m. We won't finish any later than that. If anyone needs to leave earlier than that, obviously you are volunteers in a lot of cases, and you have family commitments at home, and 8 o'clock, I know for my children, is after their bedtime. So it may be the case for you. If you do need to leave, rest assured you'll be able to access the recording after tonight's session. So if you do ask a question, can I ask that you pop your name and organisation in your question either at the start or the end, just so that we can be really clear on who it is that's asked the question, and we can address we can provide information that's most relevant to your organisation. And also, if we don't get to cover off on all the questions at the end of the session, we'll know who to contact to provide a response. So you all know that Moreton Bay is a wonderful place to live. A huge array of pristine coastal villages to rural townships and bustling urban spaces. It's a really diverse region. It's got heaps to offer. However, because Moreton Bay region is located in southeast Queensland, we are prone to disaster. Flooding, storms, bushfires, and a host of other natural disasters are simply an unavoidable part of our day-to-day lives. It's imperative then that we are well prepared for natural disasters and the impact that they can have on our community facilities, which are worth hundreds of millions of dollars throughout the region. Natural disasters, as some of you know all too well firsthand, can affect our community facilities either directly through damage to premises, stock and equipment, or indirectly through things like disruptions to power or communication or transport services. So Moreton Bay Regional Council's Disaster Resilience Program has been designed to support community organisations such as all of yours throughout the region to effectively prepare for, respond to, and recover from natural disasters. As I say, you know all of this, and I'm preaching to the converted. It's important that we don't just pay lip service to building disaster resilience, but that we actually implement the planning and preparation so that when disaster strikes, we're able to respond and recover quickly and as efficiently as possible. When discussing disaster resilience and disaster planning, I often point to an example of happily working away on your computer every day. And I spend a lot of time in front of my computer, so this is certainly something that rings true for me. And you're saving files away and expecting that they'll be there for future reference when you want to reopen them. And then one day you come back to your computer and hit the power button and it doesn't turn on. The thing completely dies and you can't retrieve any of those really important files that you've saved away, expecting that they'll be there for future access. Inevitably then, when you share this experience with other people, they ask if you had the computer backed up. Did you have your files stored on an external hard drive? Or even better, did you have a backup in the cloud? And of course, you respond in frustration and ask something like, where the hell were you a week ago? Why didn't you ask me that question then? Funnily enough, though, it's really rare for people to routinely ask others if their computer or digital files are safely backed up, unless you're me and you're a nerd, because I ask that sort of stuff in the regular course of conversations with people. But it's often when things go wrong that our lack of preparation is really clearly highlighted. And this is most certainly the case when it comes to disaster resilience. So as well as this education and training and the provision of extensive templates and resources to make your lives, again, as volunteers, a little easier in doing disaster resilience and disaster planning well, Council itself is working to enhance its own disaster management processes relating to their support of your organisation when things go wrong and disaster strikes. So the Council, in our opinion, should be applauded through the delivery of this program, because this project is not about only supporting organisations such as all of you, but it's also about learning. It's only almost exactly 12 months ago, it's a little over 12 months ago, that some of the most recent flooding happened in the Moreton Bay region and throughout other areas of the state. It's not so long before that we were struggling with bushfires. It's vital that we learn. And one of the things that we're going to talk through this evening is using disasters as a learning opportunity. When things go wrong, soon after we've responded and when we're in the recovery phase, we should really sit down and critically analyse how well we dealt with that disaster and any areas for improvement. Because the longer that time goes on after a disaster, the more we forget those things, and it's really hard to cast our minds back to 6, 12 months or longer and try and remember what it was that worked well and what it was that didn't work so well. So Council has been, since the floods, improving its own approach to disaster response and to support, particularly in the context of this evening, for community organisations such as all of yours. So tonight, I'm going to show you some images that we've snatched from some local organisations, and you'll recognise, in some cases, some of the images. But the images largely focus on flooding. And like I say, that's because it's the most recent natural disaster that we've faced. However, the Disaster Resilience Action Plan template and the resources that we'll show you through this evening and that will be made available to you from tomorrow morning broadly address a wide range of natural disasters. We're not just focusing on flood, because as we know, our weather patterns are changing significantly. They're fluctuating massively, And we can expect that in the not too distant future, we won't be so concerned about floods, but we'll be concerned about drought, heat waves, bushfires, fires, and so on. So the disaster resilience plan has been the template that you can all make use of, has been designed to address a wide range of natural disasters, recognizing the fact that we do have quite unpredictable, to a degree, other than being able to predict that we can expect disasters of some description because we're living where we live, rather than just floods. Speaking of some images, the scale and impact of our weather events here in Southeast Queensland, and more specifically in Moreton Bay, make us one of the most disaster affected areas in the country. So here in Moreton Bay, we've arguably experienced 2 1-in-100-year floods in just over a decade. Now, that term 1-in-100-year flood is misleading and is therefore being used a little less frequently these days. And I'll come back to that a little later on and point to the terminology that's more frequently or increasingly frequently used now to predict flood risk in certain areas. But the impacts of climate change will likely mean that we're going to experience more floods, more natural disasters, and more extreme weather events. So we've got to become better prepared, and we can't become complacent. So these are some images from around the region of organisations that were really heavily affected by the recent flood in 2022. And you can see that we've got a range of impacts, both internal building related as well as external infrastructure. So this is a horse and pony club that had its riding areas decimated. So yes, we're prone to disaster, but there are things that we can do. So this image here points to some disaster resilience design in infrastructure. So the image on the left shows a building that has been constructed above a certain level of predicted flood height. And the image on the right shows some flood resilient design in the design and construction of the kitchen area. So the gentleman in that image is hosing off a stainless steel bench, and the cabinetry is also constructed of stainless steel. So the idea is sporting infrastructure, community infrastructure is often located in areas where we can't build other stuff. It's often the case that we are in disaster prone areas, whether we're in flood prone areas, whether we're on low lying land near creeks and rivers, or we're in close proximity to dense vegetation. We often have this situation where we're a little more disaster prone in the community sector. So in some cases, we're unable to stop our infrastructure from being affected by disaster. But what we can do is we can incorporate disaster resilient design into the construction of our infrastructure, so that when we are affected by floods, for instance, we're able to get in and clean things up as quickly as possible. That cabinetry, that stainless steel and sheet metal cabinetry, does not need to be removed and replaced. Rather, it gets hosed out, probably significantly disinfected, and then we can sooner get back to restocking and operating for the benefit of our members and customers. So I'm going to come back to that particular image on the right a little later in the discussion. But it's important to note that it's not only us at the grassroots of sport, recreation, community service delivery that's affected by floods. This, as some of you will recognise. Now, I recognise that I should have probably included here an image of the Dolphin Stadium, but this readily available image of Suncorp Stadium demonstrates the decimation that both the 2011 and 2022 floods had on the Southeast Queensland region. So it's not only us at the grassroots level that's affected. Okay, so have your fingers ready, and I want you to pop a response into the chat window and answer this question. Does your organisation currently have a disaster management plan? So I want you to say yes, no, or if you want to take the easy option, you can say not sure. This is really interesting. We've had 3 yeses so far, 1 no, a few more no's coming in. So there's a pretty good mix there. Thanks, Dolores. Welcome, lovely to see you online. So I think the no's have it, but not by as much of a margin as I expected. There are a good number of organisations that are saying, yes, we've got a disaster management plan. One attendee has said, not a formal one, but we are aware of potential problems. That's a really good point. Now, often when we talk about any type of planning, we're often referring to the need to document the stuff that we're already discussing. So when we have organisations come to us and say, hey, we want to do a strategic plan, often those organisations already know a lot of the things, a lot of the desired outcomes or goals or objectives, as well as the actions, the operational actions to achieve those desired outcomes that they want included in their plan. And those organisations recognise that we're having regular, monthly, for instance, management committee meetings, and we're talking about ideas and things that we want to implement in the future. But those things just get documented in the monthly meeting minutes, and we don't have one concise, easily accessible and monitorable location where all of those ideas are included. So the same is often true in disaster resilience, especially when we've recently been through some type of natural disaster. It's a little more top of mind for people. And so Steve, who's kindly shared that, their organisation doesn't have a formal disaster management plan, but they're aware of potential problems. I'm guessing that given that organisation is aware of some potential problems, they've probably started to discuss potential solutions. So the idea of a disaster management plan or a disaster resilience action plan is that you're documenting the things that are in your minds already, in some cases. But the way that we've constructed the template is that it's quite leading. So we've got a lot of ideas in there, that some of which you will have considered and some of which you may not have considered. Some of the ideas and actions in the action plan may not even relate to your organisation, and that's okay. You can delete them from your plan because it's a completely editable document that I'll show you through very shortly. But really what I'm getting at here is this is not a huge task to complete this plan. We've created, in partnership with Council, this comprehensive suite of resources, as well as the template plan itself, to make your life as easy as possible. It shouldn't take you very long, i.e., your plan could be complete in just one committee meeting by sitting down and putting your heads together and discussing the things that are already floating around in your minds and that you've already been exploring in the way of problems and ideas. It's great. I've just seen Steve say, yes, we are. I'm assuming that you're referring to aware of some solutions there or discussing solutions. So that's great to hear, Steve. Thank you. And you guys, therefore, as well as plenty of others online this evening, as well as those of you who are watching the recording of this session, will be able to use these resources to very promptly get a plan in place. And really, when it comes to disaster planning, it's for any of you who have read Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, you'll know that it's the urgent stuff that often keeps us occupied. The problem with focusing always on the urgent stuff is that the important stuff drops off the bottom. And when it comes to disaster resilience, if the important stuff, i.e. preparing a plan so that you all are clear and in agreement as to what to do when disaster is looming or when it strikes, then you're going to suffer the consequences if you don't have that preparation in place. And unfortunately, then when the response to a disaster or the recovery from a disaster becomes urgent, you're not in as healthy a position as possible to react and implement your well-founded plan. And often, therefore, you'll kind of shoot from the hip and you'll be making mistakes along the way as well. So the idea of this process is to bring forward the important stuff when we're not suffering the impacts of disaster right now. So it's not urgent, but do this important planning so that when disaster does strike, you're really well prepared. Excellent. Steve is preparing and enacting a resilience plan for the golf course. Good. Well, you can make use of the template that you'll get access to through this evening's session, and hopefully it will prompt you to include some things that you might not have considered. And for those of you who already have an action plan or already have a disaster management plan, it's important to note that you don't need to throw that out and start again with the template that we'll provide. Rather, what we suggest you do is stick with potentially the format that you're used to working in, and look to embellish it with ideas and actions and inclusions from both the action plan template as well as the host of resources that you'll get access to through this session. So good disaster planning, just to cover off on a little bit of the business continuity considerations then. Good disaster planning comes down to running a good business. Now, in almost every session that we at CPR Group run, we link back to this point. And a well-run business should have appropriate risk management plans in place. And this includes all sorts of things: financial risk management, member protection, child protection, but it also includes disaster planning, disaster management, and disaster resilience. So every not-for-profit organization is a business. If we start, and I know we've got a good cross-section of community organisations online this evening, but let's start just by talking about sport. You charge fees and you provide a service. What about a craft club? Well, it might be a local quilting society that operates out of a pavilion at the showgrounds, or a charity such as a domestic violence support group or a return services support organisation, as Robin mentioned earlier. These are still businesses. In the case of sport, you can think about who is the customer, and the customer is the recipient of the service, or maybe their kids if the parents are paying. When considering other community organisations, the recipient of service may not actually pay, but they may be funded by government, or the organisation may be funded, or charity may be funded by government to support that customer or member. Either way, your organisations are being paid in some way to deliver a service, and in some cases, products as well. So it's all business. Yes, not-for-profit business, but business all the same. So speaking of not-for-profit, what does not-for-profit actually mean? It's a really silly term, and it's confusing, and it causes a lot of people in decision-making roles within community organisations to make less than optimal decisions. That was probably the most diplomatic term that I have ever used: less than optimal decisions. So what do I mean by that? Think about how many clubs, community organisations, sporting associations, national sporting organisations, and even franchises that we heard whinging throughout COVID that they were in financial dire straits. Plenty. Many of those, however, that were complaining, I think, could have done more to prepare themselves for a proverbial, in the case of COVID and the associated lockdowns, rainy day. And I don't mean to sound dismissive here. I'm simply reiterating the point that not-for-profits are businesses, and they need to be responsible for their own long-term viability. Like I say, we at CPR Group often promise that we won't apologise for coming back to this point in almost every single session that we run when we provide training for not-for-profit groups like all of yours. But not-for-profit does not mean no profit. The term not-for-profit purely means that your organisation exists not for the profit of your members. It means you can't distribute profits as dividends amongst your members. Your members are not shareholders, they are members of your organisation. Now, I'm not implying that your organisation should be striving to make profit at the expense of everything else, of all other focus, because in reality, if that was the case, you probably wouldn't last very long in the real world. But what I'm imploring your organisations to do is to recognise that even though you're not for profit, and even literally last night, I was running a planning session with quite a large hockey association and their affiliated clubs. And the president of the hockey association said, you know, we're a true not-for-profit because we don't make profit. And, you know, we really just scrape in from one year to the next, and we're happy about that. And that may be the case for some of your organizations. That's fine. However, there's a very good chance that those organizations that are just scraping in from one year to the next and aren't taking control of their own financial destiny want stuff done. They want stuff done that's going to cost money. Now, whether that's recovering from natural disaster, whether that's embellishing their infrastructure to provide better services to members or customers, whether that's enabling the organization to expand its service delivery so that more people can access its services. Generally, organizations want to spend money. The money has to come from somewhere. So why is this important when we talk about disaster resilience? Because if you don't understand this, you run the risk of your organization developing a mindset of dependence. Dependence on things like grants, sponsorship, philanthropy, or even more generally, council or the government. But know this, there are almost 30,000 incorporated associations in Queensland alone. They're all not-for-profits, because to be a not-for-profit, to be an incorporated association, you've got to be not-for-profit, i.e. you can't distribute your profits amongst your members. Therefore, you are one of many, and councils, state, federal government simply can't afford to prop up, you know, the many thousands of organizations that exist across the country. You need to take control of your own destiny. And we often, funnily enough, hear the word profit used almost as a profanity within volunteer organizations. And we, you know, we hear people say, oh, no, we don't make a profit. It's a surplus. We made a surplus this year because we can't make profit. We say, whoa, it's a profit and loss statement, man. It's a P&L. So if you want a profit, because if you don't make a profit, you've got to do one of two things: break even or lose money. There are only so many years in a row that you can do one of those things before you run out of money. So we've got to leave this pervasive mindset that we should be striving not to make profit or not to make money behind. And we've got to recognize that each of your organizations must actually strive to make a profit from one year to the next. Again, we're not driven by profits, but if we don't make a profit, then are we going to be around in 10, 15, 20 years to provide our great services? Maybe not. So you are building your financial sustainability by trading profitably. And this, therefore, in turn, enables you to continue to deliver your great services for many years to come, despite what disasters might and very likely will come our way. So what are we talking about? We're talking about predominantly natural disasters, and the Disaster Resilience Action Plan template and the associated resources relate to natural disasters. So here is a very short rundown of what we're talking about. We're talking about flood. That's top of mind. It's recent. We've been hit by a couple of nasty floods in southeast Queensland and further south on the eastern seaboard in a little over 10 years. But we're also talking about storms and cyclones, as well as storm surges and tsunamis. We're also talking about bushfires and other fires, droughts, heat waves, and we are hearing increasingly from our disaster planning and weather forecast pundits that we're possibly heading into a drier period, and that will likely be accompanied by weather extremes that don't necessarily bring flood, but might bring nasty storms and also potentially bushfire, drought and heat waves. But we're also talking about things like earthquakes, landslides and landfill subsidence. So sometimes we've got sport and recreation infrastructure that is developed on old landfill sites. Now, sometimes the landfill decommissioning process falls short, and that leads to nasty things happening during the use of those decommissioned landfill sites for other purposes such as sport and physical activity. So these things do happen. Yes, you're probably looking at that list and thinking, oh, well, none of that stuff we've got to worry about. Yep, Right now, you're probably right. But guess what? Things are changing. Our climate's changing, and the likelihood of the nature of our natural disasters changing is pretty good as well. So the good news is that the resources that you're going to get access to are going to guide you through building your organization's resilience regardless of the type of natural disaster. There are other disasters that strike as well. Obviously, that pretty little picture on the right-hand side there, I'm pretty confident all sick of seeing after the last few years. And if you're anything like me, I didn't really give much thought to the likelihood of living through a pandemic. It's been, COVID-19 is 2019, therefore 101 years after the last, broadly recognized global pandemic. And I didn't really give thought to the fact that we might live through a pandemic. But guess what? It has literally changed the course of history, and it has changed our lives for the last few years. So what other disasters, natural or otherwise, might be around the corner that we are not yet giving enough consideration to? But we're also, prone to major transport accidents. Good heavens, the Bruce Highway is between the Sunshine Coast and Moreton Bay. And a lot of you, like myself, probably travel that road regularly, and it can't deal. Its disaster resilience is really underwhelming. The Bruce Highway struggles. Yes, we're going through a significant process of upgrade, but you all experience limited disaster resilience when you're stuck in traffic on that highway due to a significant transport accident. But there are other disasters as listed there. Again, you might think terrorist act, we don't need to worry about that. But we just don't know what's around the corner. So having this discussion openly within your organization and forming a disaster resilience plan. Cyber attacks are another one that we're increasingly hearing about. Any Optus customers, any Medibank customers, any PlayStation users, you'll have experienced firsthand the impacts that a cyber attack can have. So talking about these things, and I'm hoping that my little story at the start of tonight's discussion might prompt some, if not all of you, to go and back up your computer. Don't do it to a little flash drive. Go and back up the really important stuff that's on your computer to the cloud. Hopefully, that's an immediate action that you can put in place, both personally and for your organization. So I'm going to introduce you now to the PPRR model of disaster management. So disaster management typically comprises these 4 phases: prevention or mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. As I mentioned, this model is known as the PPRR model, which is a really imaginative name. I'm sure you'll all agree. Now, this approach helps to ensure a balance between the reduction of risk and the enhancement of community resilience, at the same time as ensuring effective response and recovery capabilities. The model has come under some criticism more recently, with an argument being mounted that the model is oversimplified and implies that each phase should be considered in isolation from one another. However, we really love the model in the community sector due to its simplicity and its ease of implementation. You can get your head around it really easily. So the 4 phases of PPRR are not linear, and nor are they independent of one another. They overlap and they support each other, as you can see on the diagram on your screen. For instance, recovery activities are likely to begin during the response phase, and prevention and mitigation strategies for next time might even be considered during the recovery phase. Importantly, the preparedness and resilience of community organisations like all of yours requires decision makers, committee members, staff, as well as members and customers to share responsibility. It's not all just on the committee, and it's not all on government. It's not all on council. We have a shared approach to disaster management to achieve the best outcomes. So by working through each phase of this PPRR framework, community organisations in the Moreton Bay region can reduce the impact of disasters on their members, assets, and operations. So each phase outlines important activities and processes that can help minimise the impact of disasters and ensure an effective response. So in the prevention or mitigation phase, activities aim to prevent or mitigate the effect of disasters. And I emphasize effect because we as community organisations can't stop the natural disasters from happening in the first place. But what we can do is mitigate against the impact that those disasters have on our organisation. Similarly, the preparedness phase involves activities that ensure that your organisation is prepared to effectively respond to disasters when things go wrong. The response phase involves the immediate actions taken in response to a disaster that then lead nicely into the recovery phase, where we're aiming to restore infrastructure access, clean things up, get back on our feet and enable our operations to recommence. So the framework emphasises, as I mentioned, the importance of collaboration, the importance of community engagement and participation in disaster management, which can help build resilience. So the framework, we reckon, provides a practical and adaptable approach that can be used by almost any organisation, particularly small businesses and community organisations, to improve your disaster preparedness, response and recovery efforts. So I'm going to just talk through each of these 4 phases, but it's important to note that the disaster resilience action plan template puts prevention and mitigation and preparedness together, because, like I say, there's only so much that we can do to prevent, a little more we can do to mitigate the impacts, but really we're kind of talking about being well prepared for disasters in that vein. So natural disasters, particularly things like floods, storms, even bushfires in terms of your organisation's control, can't be prevented by your organisation. However, what we can do is implement mitigation measures to help lessen the impact of natural disasters on our organisation when things go wrong. Good mitigation includes having a comprehensive, up-to-date disaster resilience action plan, and then the implementation of proactive, targeted prevention and mitigation strategies that are designed to address likely risk factors, the vulnerability of your volunteers, members and customers, and also to reduce or eliminate the possible impact of disasters, helps to ensure safer, more resilient and more sustainable community organisations. So these are just a few high-level prevention and mitigation measures. So building it right the first time. And, I'm sure that some, if not many of you, have experienced, that volunteer working bee where we get in and build the retaining wall. But look, when completing construction projects, consider whether volunteer labour is sufficient, or if you should be paying the right money to the right people to do the job right the first time. I have seen plenty of examples of poorly completed construction projects, and in some cases tragically leading to injury or death. So, like I mentioned, retaining walls, non-compliant goalposts, mobile media towers, and so on. So wherever we can learn from some of those tragedies that have gone before and take the time and spend the money to do things right and hopefully avoid some of those things going wrong in future, it's certainly a wise thing to consider. So facility management and usage, using the right spaces for the right types of activities, competition space and training spaces, your change rooms, not storing things in your change room. Interestingly, increasingly now councils, including Moreton Bay, include in their tenure documentation the need to use areas for their designated purpose. So don't use your football change rooms for storage of your post pads and your line marker and so on, because that prohibits the ability to use that room for the right purpose, but it also creates problems when disaster strikes. So allocate the right areas for the right activities and make sure that people adhere to those allocations. Educating your members. Let members know about your disaster resilience action plan as soon as you can after they join your organisation. Send them to the website, point them to your evacuation plan and your disaster resilience posters and flashcards that we'll share with you this evening. Let them know the risks of disaster. Let them know if you're on a floodplain. Let them know if you've been affected by bushfire in the past, for instance. So, like I mentioned, there's only so much we can do in prevention and mitigation. So we're now going to move on to preparedness. And this represents the first section in the disaster resilience action plan template, which looks a little bit like this. So I'm not going to talk you through the plan in great detail because you're all going to get to enjoy that in your own time once you're able to access the document tomorrow. But you'll see, for the benefit of those watching live this evening, as well as those watching the recording, or any of you who are watching tonight and come back to watch the recording, that some sections of this Disaster Resilience Action Plan template, as well as other resources, are highlighted in yellow. That's to draw your attention directly to the stuff that you must update, because it's either example information or it's sitting there incomplete. So, to identify the objectives of your Disaster Resilience Action Plan, there's some ideas there to prompt you. Some of your organisations may already have a plan, as we've touched on, and you might look to bolster that from some of the content in this document. So I'm going to fast forward to the preparedness section, which, as I mentioned, puts prevent and prepare together. So you can see that the action plan is laid out with a lot of actions already populated. So in prevention and preparedness, we've covered natural disasters broadly speaking, and the columns which ring true through the entire action plan template are actions on the left, so things to do. Now, this is a completely editable Microsoft Word document, as I mentioned, so you can simply add extra rows by clicking in the bottom right cell and hitting tab. It'll add another row there. You can type whatever you wish and then go and allocate some of these points in the same way that you're asked to do so against the suggested actions, which include who's responsible for it, and I'll come back to that in a moment. When are we going to get this stuff done? Is it ongoing? Do we have to have things done annually? Is it something that we've got to complete by a certain date? And then where, if applicable, and if that action relates to some particular document, for instance, preparing an evacuation plan based on a template available from the Fire and Emergency Services page, where have we saved it? Again, not on one computer that's not backed up, but ideally in the cloud, in some central repository, which is accessible not only by you, but by anyone with the login ID and password that you share it with internally. And the idea is that that makes succession a whole lot easier as well, because you're not having to copy information from your computer to someone else's for them to be able to access it on an ongoing basis. You're simply handing over a login ID and password, hopefully with two-factor authentication set up so that you don't lose your own information due to some cyber attack. But identification of where that documentation, if relevant, is stored. So general preparation for natural disasters first, and then we get into some more specific disaster-specific actions. So severe storms, floods and cyclones, bushfires and fires, and so on. So this is a really comprehensive action plan. Like I mentioned, some of the actions are not going to apply to your organisation. If that's the case, simply delete the action. If it doesn't relate to you, pull it out. By the same token, if there's other stuff that you want to add in, you can either do that in the respective specific sections, or you can populate this other disaster preparation action section specific to your organisation. So a couple of other templates that relate then just briefly to the preparedness phase of the PPRR model of disaster resilience include this little charter for your disaster resilience working group. Now, as I mentioned, I've been working with volunteers for almost my entire adult working life. So I understand that we're not blessed with a situation where we have a really large number of people sticking their hands up to help out as volunteers. So I am abundantly aware of the fact that your disaster resilience working group may well be your management committee, or it may well include people who are also on your management committee. And that's okay. If you're able to achieve some separation from the management committee, that's great, because you're activating the human potential that exists throughout your organization's membership and getting more people involved in the organization's successful operations. But we really don't want this to be a barrier to your organization's adopting and implementing a disaster resilience action plan itself. So either seek to pull together a group of people who are known as your disaster resilience working group, or start by giving the task to your management committee to get things going and to create the plan. And then you may find that people come out of the woodwork as you start to promote your disaster resilience action plan, and you start to have the conversations about, you know, we're well prepared for disasters should they strike. And if disaster strikes, here's a poster that outlines our response activities so that you're all firstly informed, but secondly, able to contribute in a positive manner to those activities rather than detract in a detrimental manner from those activities being efficiently completed. So I know that it is, it's a little utopian to expect that all of your organizations are going to be able to find a host of people such as, you know, a chairperson, a lead for communications, evacuations, volunteers and recovery, such as is outlined in this working group charter. But it's here as a starting point to prompt you towards best practice, but don't let it hold you back from actually creating the plan itself. So we've also then got a host of disaster resilience preparation checklists that have been developed. So I'm going to briefly show you these on the screen as well. And I'm really demonstrating these to create a level of familiarity with the resources for you so that you've seen them. Hopefully that gets you over the first hurdle of actually opening the documents up and starting to populate the documents themselves. So still in the preparation phase, these are some really simple preparation checklists that prompt you to make sure your organization has considered the things that might make your life difficult when disaster strikes. So that then leads into some of the points on this slide. So first things first, fill in your disaster resilience action plan. Yes, this is a big sales pitch for you to actually complete the plan, but that's because I know that your organizations will significantly benefit from having those plans in place when inevitably disaster does hit. We have an adage at CPR Group, which is that systems are better than sweetheart deals. So what we mean by that is don't rely on just individuals knowing everything. Rather, have a system according to which almost anyone can implement a successful action. And a disaster resilience action plan is absolutely that tool. So I mentioned earlier this 1 in 100 year flood terminology. Like I mentioned, it's misleading and people think, oh, we've had a flood. It was a 1 in 100 year flood. We're good for another 99 years. It's not the case. So for that reason, we're now increasingly seeing this term annual exceedance probability. Yep, it's a really nerdy technical engineer type term, and its acronym is AEP. So the annual exceedance probability, if we were to look at a particular site and say, okay, well, at that particular height above sea level, or Australian height datum, AHD, at that particular height AHD, this site has a 1 in 100 year flood risk. Rather than 1 in 100 year allocation of that terminology, we would say that there's a 1% annual exceedance probability, or AEP, so a 1% chance that height will be reached by floodwaters. So it seems like a somewhat innocuous terminology change, but I think that it's a far more accurate representation of flood risk than people thinking we're good for another 99 years because we've just had a really nasty flood. So many organizations fail to carry out simple preventative maintenance activities. And that's because you've got so much other stuff going on in your life. You've got work, work life, you've got home life, you maintain your house, you make sure you get your air conditioner vents serviced at home, but you might forget to do it at your community organization facility. So these activities, such as clearing leaves from your gutters and downpipes, periodical facility inspections, maintaining roof-mounted equipment, can help avoid costly damage when disaster hits. It's one thing to have an asset register, but it's something else to then have a preventative maintenance register. So we've created an asset management tool called Asset Track. If you're interested, go and have a look at assettrack.com.au, and that tool not only acts as your register for assets, but it also prompts you to conduct important maintenance activity when it becomes due. So incorporating disaster resilient elements into your facility design, so moving electrical boxes or air conditioning units a little higher than the flood level to try and reduce damage, moving lighting pole internal drivers higher up the poles, replacing carpet with vinyl, as I mentioned earlier, using flood resilient building materials so you can just hose it out rather than having to rip everything out and replace it. The gold standard when we're talking about water, so the gold standard in flood resilient design is to get rid of cavities. Anywhere there's a cavity is a prime location for mud and silt, and in the longer term, mold. So it's difficult to keep water out, especially given that often our community facilities are on flood-prone land or disaster-prone land. So it's better to accept that you're there and to implement disaster-resilient design to better cope with disaster when it strikes. Storage of equipment and hazardous materials, get it up high if you can. Quite often the expense and management difficulties make it not worth it. For instance, lazy coaches putting stuff on the bench in the change room instead of putting it in high cupboards. You can't have storage areas that aren't used properly and then have change rooms, as I've said, where all your stuff is stored. Document and data storage, I've done that. Make sure your stuff's backed up. Training and exercises. We're not talking about doing a drill every week, but we're striving for best practice. Importantly, though, have an evacuation plan. And as I touched on earlier, the action plan template points you to an evacuation plan template that you can tailor for your organisation. We suggest that all committee members and other volunteers in designated roles register for Moreton Bay Regional Council's Moreton Alert Service, which is a great service that gives prompt, early and regular updates. Keep a list of emergency contacts so that you know to whom you should reach out, and there's a place for this in the resources. As I've said, maintain good relationships. That includes with your insurance broker and also peak bodies if you're a sporting organisation that has insurance organised by them. And as I somewhat critically pointed to earlier, keep money in the bank for either a proverbial or literal rainy day, as you may need to replace items before insurance or funding becomes available. Remember that at times of natural disaster, insurance companies are usually flogged, and a claim, even if eligible, might take quite some time. I'm going to point now to a theory which is known as the bystander effect. It's also known as the diffusion of responsibility or mob mentality. And this theory explains why humans often fail to do the right thing because they're too tied up doing what everyone else is doing. Now, all sorts of experiments have been conducted since the mid-1960s to test this theory. And one of the most prevalent that sticks in my mind is called the smoke-filled room study. So if you're interested, just Google or enter into YouTube smoke-filled room. And it's fascinating to see just how strong this psychological phenomena is. So there are essentially two conflicting rules of human nature when the bystander effect is in play. One, do the right thing. Two, do what everyone else is doing. And often doing what everyone else is doing is such a strong draw that people do that rather than doing the right thing. So in this example, there's the first example is a lady who's in a room by herself, and she's filling in, some aptitude test, for instance. Lots of empty seats around her. Smoke starts to billow in under the door from the room next door. And she immediately, when she notices the smoke, stands up and goes and finds someone and says, hey, smoke under the door, building might be on fire, life might be in danger, let's do something. Then it cuts to a lady who's sitting in the room with Confederates. So those other chairs are filled, and they all know that smoke's going to start getting pumped under the door. So when she notices the smoke, the timer starts, and she immediately ceases being able to complete anything in her little aptitude test. And everyone else, because they know that it's going to happen, sits there ignoring the smoke and continuing to apparently fill in their tests. She sits there for not 5, not 10, but 20 minutes. By that time, a rapid moving fire could have well and truly burnt the building down. And they realised, the people conducting the test, that she's never going to stand up and say, hey, does anyone else notice that the building might be on fire? So they put a stop to the test and come and say, you failed. But there are a whole bunch of examples, like I say, that have been used to demonstrate just how strong this is. But when disaster strikes your organisation, do the right thing. Stick to your plan, implement the actions that you've set out in the plan. Even if others get caught up in the emergency and fail to do so, be a leader and don't be led. So that ties beautifully into then exercising some disaster safety. So when things are going wrong, don't drive into floodwater or fire zones. Don't, so many people say, oh, just before I got washed off the road by rapid moving floodwater, I saw someone else drive through safely before me, so I thought I'd be okay to do it. Just because you've seen someone else do it doesn't mean that it's a good idea. If it's flooded, forget it. If it's burning, forget it. Don't go near it. And this also applies to your organisation. Keep informed about weather patterns, weather forecasts, act quickly on advice. If you've signed up for alerts, including Morton Alert and any others, you will be getting the information that you need. So like I promised, I've included this image a second time in this presentation because I think it's imperative to really point you to the fact that there are things that you can do in creating resilience within the design of your organization that can be as simple as the materials used. So we've got, as one of the resources, recovery information sheets that will be made available to you. And we've also got posters that guide people, or as well as flashcards that guide people in your organization through some of these key steps. But before you go anywhere near your facility, and this is front and center in one of the flashcards, make sure you've got permission to return to the site, because people such as all of you care so much about your organizations. You're often prone to putting the organization before your own health and well-being or safety. So, as soon as, if we're talking about flood, for instance, as soon as the level of floodwaters goes above the toilet bowl, it's no longer only floodwater. So what that means, if we're talking about sporting fields, is that there's a whole host of potentially really dangerous pathogens that have found their way onto your playing surface. If we're talking about, internal infrastructure, clubhouses, community halls, and the like, we are also potentially dealing with some really harmful, hazardous substances or chemicals that haven't been stored high enough and are now floating around and have, found their way onto our external surfaces that we might touch. So it's imperative that you don't go anywhere near your site until council has given you express permission to do so. Don't put yourself in danger to start the recovery too early. Remember that the earthquakes that do the most damage are often aftershocks. When everyone thinks everything's hunky-dory, they get back into their, somewhat damaged premises, and then the aftershock hits and a whole lot more damage happens with them inside. Ensuring that you've got permission before returning to your facility will help keep everybody safe. Those who are qualified should inspect and confirm that it's okay for you to get in there. When it's safe to do so, then your services can be reconnected and you can, look to start the cleanup effort and start to get back on the journey to operating again. As soon as possible after the disaster, someone should write down what happened and how you responded. You will easily forget small details when the recovery starts, and some of what you document might be needed for insurance, or even worse, a potential court case or coronial inquiry. So we're talking about potentially really serious stuff here. Make sure that you are keeping good written records. Take photos. As we were really easily able to find a bunch of images from organizations across the region in pulling this session together. And we will be, over the coming weeks, interviewing a handful of organizations that have learnt really valuable lessons through their disaster recovery, and they'll be shared at the same link that you're going to get the recording from tonight's session, as well as all of these resources that I'm talking you through this evening. And hopefully you'll be able to learn a little something from those organizations as well. But the reason that those organisations are able to talk with us meaningfully is because they kept really good records as they followed the recovery process. Record your expenditure accurately, retain all receipts, no matter how trivial those receipts might seem at the time. This is a must-have for claiming on insurance or grant reimbursements. Having an up-to-date asset register will also streamline the process of claiming on your insurance. And most of us struggle to remember more than a handful of assets that our organisation owns. So an asset register ensures that nothing gets missed. Assess your financial position. If you're running a successful business, as I harped on about earlier, and you've got money in the bank, you'll be well equipped to recover more quickly and to get back on your feet. Get in touch with counsel, and more specifically, perhaps even your regular business as usual counsel contact. That might be your sport and rec officer or development officer, community development officer. Find out what cleanup and recovery resources or support might be available. These people are really, really well connected, and they'll generally have the most information very soon after it becomes available. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that they're going to be really busy supporting other organisations, and they might have even been affected personally at home. So be patient, and again, because we're all about the people, I'm going to say be kind. Environmental recovery is important to consider also. Many of your organisations access land which is of itself some environmental significance, or you might be located adjacent to land that is environmentally significant. Ensure that your cleanup efforts focus on safe, effective and environmentally conscious ways of disposing of waste and any damaged goods. During the recovery, when things are fresh, like I've touched on, and maybe even a little raw, it's generally the best time to think about things to learn for next time. So one of the resources that you'll have access to is a disaster review template, and it prompts you to do the evaluation as soon as possible after the disaster has hit and as you're recovering, so that things are fresh in your mind and you're able to remember very clearly the things that you did well and the areas where you may have fallen short, and to learn from for next time to make sure you don't make any mistakes again. You might identify the need for further resilience measures to be incorporated into the design of your facility, such as using, aluminium, sheet metal rather than chipboard and the like for your cabinetry. Throughout the recovery phase, maintain open and regular communication with your members. Or keep in touch with council, keep in touch with your governing body, keep in touch with state government. And we have included in the disaster resilience templates communication plan. So it's appendix, let me tell you, 3 is a communications plan, and it includes a communication cascade, which outlines who should hand information on to whom and how that information should be disseminated. And it includes some other really important elements like messaging and meaningful engagement with your members, customers, and other external stakeholders. So again, that template makes it really easy for you to think about the sorts of things that you should be putting into place when you're not necessarily going to be thinking really clearly. And to just delve into that point momentarily, this is also why disaster resilience planning is so important, because when things go wrong, human nature is to panic. And, often if you take a sporting analogy, for instance, on game day or grand final day, rather, you shouldn't come up with new plays. Stick to what you know best and what you've been implementing through the entire season, and put those plays into practice to achieve the same outcomes that have gotten you to the grand final. Don't go making up, new wacky ideas for new plays on grand final day. The same is true in disaster resilience. When disaster strikes, pull that plan out and be so familiar with it that you know exactly which cloud folder it's stored in, and you can access that document readily, and you can start to implement the actions that are outlined in that document in terms of response and recovery without needing to think too deeply, without needing to be concerned that you might be swayed by panic to some degree. Around the region, there are plenty of examples of community organisations that, for instance, were better prepared for the 2022 floods compared with 2011. So having learnt some important lessons. So as I mentioned, over the next few weeks, we're going to be releasing some videos in partnership with Council that will go onto the same page where you can access tonight's session and resources that are going to showcase some of these examples from interviews with groups that I reckon we can all learn something from. So things like, moving services higher up, goalposts, higher up, lighting towers, moving switchboards a little higher up, flood resilient design in kitchens, such as what I mentioned earlier, greater clearing around infrastructure so that should bushfire hit, there's a fire break between vegetation and our built infrastructure. So it's important, I think, that we're exposed to the learning outcomes that other organizations are able to share, because you can sit here and listen to a nerd like me that loves to write disaster resilience action plans and loves to support organizations such as yours and impart any experiences that we've gathered over the years of working with community groups and their volunteers. But it can mean a whole lot more when you hear it from your peers. It can mean a whole lot more when you hear it from people who are running an organization very similar to yours in a voluntary capacity, and they've struggled with the same or similar challenges that you're struggling with. It can hit home a lot clearer. So we're coming to the end of the formal proceedings for this evening, and we're running pretty well in terms of time. So we've definitely got time for some questions. Before we get into the questions, I'm going to share with you, importantly, the first link. So the first link, cprgroup.com.au/MBRC, is a link with which you are familiar if you're attending in person tonight, because that's the same link where you registered for tonight's session. So as of tomorrow, that registration form will be gone, and in its place will be all of the resources other than the recording of tonight's session, which will be made available in the coming days. So in addition to that important link where you'll find all of the resources, there's a couple of email addresses down the bottom of your screen there. So the first one is the Sport and Recreation team at Council. Regardless of the type of your organisation, if you have any specific questions for Council, they will be expecting that question after this session and in the coming weeks and months to land in that inbox. And if it's not a specific sport and recreation matter, they'll forward it on to the relevant people within Council who need to receive that question. Similarly, if you've got any questions for us at CPR Group, you can get a hold of us by emailing info@cprgroup.com.au. So we certainly don't want you, but both CPR Group and Moreton Bay Regional Council don't want you to feel overwhelmed. We want you to feel really well supported through this process. If you've got questions as you're filling in the templates, let us know. We're here to hold your hand and to provide as much backing as we can to make sure that you can get this documentation pulled together. Really, the planning template itself, like I've touched on this evening, and through a quick scroll through the document, you will have been able to see it's largely populated. It's a matter of tailoring the document to your specific organization and its needs and situation. And ideally, you'll get that document pulled together pretty promptly, and you'll be really well prepared for when disaster, whatever that disaster might look like, next strikes. Okay, there haven't yet been any questions that have come in through the chat. So I'm going to, there is now a question that's come in. Pete Marriott from Moreton Bay Regional Council has just asked, does everyone like this format of training? That's a really good question. Thank you, Peter. Because as I mentioned earlier, we're coming into a new education and training series to be provided by Council for community organisations such as all of you. It's going to be valuable for us to get an understanding from any of you as to how you've found this format, this online delivery. It's great that you can receive it from the comfort of your own home. You can be cooking, cleaning, eating, changing nappies, doing whatever at the same time as listening in. So it's certainly got its benefits. There are those of us who love the face-to-face engagement, and I'm sure that, being community organisation volunteers, there are many of you amongst us tonight. But yeah, certainly in terms of accessibility, the online format's great. So I think, Peter, so far that we've got 100% positive response to that question. which is fantastic. Very good. Now, if anyone would like to ask a question verbally, feel free to pop your hand up and you can ask a question rather than having to use your fingers to type. I'll give you a couple of moments to do that. If anyone from council would like to jump in, add anything in closing, certainly feel free to do so. Anyone else from any community organisations that would like to speak up in any way, you're more than welcome to do so now, and I'll wait for just a few moments and then we might round it out.
Hi, it's Faye here. I'd like to inquire about the disaster declared areas. If Moreton Bay Council is a disaster declared area and the responsibility of the council in formulating all of the responses to put through to the DRFA grants process.
Okay, thank you very much, Faye, for that question, which is a very good question. Given its technical nature and specific nature, I might take that one on notice and get a response back to you from the best people in council, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to make a note of that. Which organisation are you from, Faye?
Redcliffe Bridge Club. Now, you haven't touched on fire other than bushfire.
Yep.
I'm concerned about vandalism and fire, particularly when council own the building. Like, I can control what happens inside our building as a tenant, but at present, I don't have this relationship with council on developing probably a joint disaster resilience plan for this structure. I can do everything for the operational component in the building, which I have done, and all of those documents are on our club website. So, you know, and that's all backed up. So we've done all of that, but it's the next step of the recovery and things like that. They're things that I don't have a control over. You know, I don't want to be the person. I would dearly like to have a contact person to work through that with on what council's responsibility is for its own buildings, of which we are a tenant.
Great, excellent. Again, a really, really good question, and
Thank you.
Thank you. Certainly acknowledge that, you know, pointing back to a point that I made earlier, this connection between your community organisation and council is imperative. You know, they're a really important stakeholder, and collaboration is definitely the key in terms of the greatest outcomes for the benefit of the community and your organisation. So again, I'll take that one on notice, Faye. Thank you. I know that there are still council people online, so they'll be across that question as well, and we'll make sure that that someone's back in touch with you promptly.
Would you like me to provide just a brief response to the disaster recovery funding arrangements one, Steve?
Chris, that'd be great. Yep, fire away.
All right, good evening, everybody. Chris Barnes, I'm the Manager of Emergency Management and Public Safety. So it was a great question there from Faye, and it's an interesting subject as to when a disaster is declared or it isn't declared. It's really a bit of a moot point whether or not a disaster is declared. What is key is the impact which the event is having on the public infrastructure and the community at large. Once we start to identify significant impact on public infrastructure and facilities, then we will reach what's essentially defined as our trigger point in terms of the costs which we're starting to incur in order to repair that damage, and then we'll automatically be entitled to disaster recovery funding arrangements. That's essentially done whilst the event is ongoing. So in February 2022, even before the waters had retreated, we'd already been in contact with Queensland Reconstruction Authority and gained authority for the activation of disaster recovery funding arrangements. It's then a matter internal within council to account for all the costs which we incur to be able to recover that damage. Some of those costs will be your operational costs, you know, the cost of closing roads, stocking sandbag stations, and doing all the day-to-day stuff. The other costs basically gathered together once we've done our damage assessments across all of the council facilities and the community, including the buildings which we're responsible for and which we're the owners of. We'll do those damage assessments. Some may be covered by insurance, and the stuff which isn't covered by insurance will be covered under a certain category of disaster recovery funding arrangements. Generally, reconstruction of essential public assets is the scheme which we use. That's a certain category. For example, we've got around about $16 million worth of projects which are in train at the moment. What that basically means is that within approximately 2 years of the declared event, all of those works will have been completed to repair those essential public assets. Now, that may incorporate some of the infrastructure which you or your club uses. The other point which you need to really touch base with is, again, through council, through the Sports and Recreation Club, so team through Peter Marriott's team. And they'll be looking at trying to ensure that you are aware and provided the information to be able to tap into all the different grant funding which is available to support the recovery of your club in whatever aspect it may be. And that will come from a range of different sources, including Queensland Reconstruction Authority, state government, federal government, and even local government grants as well. So it's a very deep and complex subject. But if you do ever have questions, then your point of call would be the council call centre, or indeed your point of contact in the sports and recreation team, and they'll be able to direct you to the right information and potentially the right individual to give you the advice. Thank you.
Brilliant, Chris. Thank you very much for that detailed response, and for sharing that in this forum so that everyone can capture that, both who's online this evening as well as those watching the recording. There's just one more question that's come in from Robin. Thanks very much for your question, Robin. Can the templates be directed towards human resource type disasters, for example, loss of members, conflict between players and officials? I note your little point. This is rhetorical. It's a great question, and it probably leads nicely into some of the other types of planning that organisations should be considering in addition to disaster resilience planning. So strategic planning, and tackling head on any prevalent issues within your organisation at the point in time when you pull a plan together, or indeed issues that cause you to agree you need a strategic plan. But also we're probably delving into the realm of codes of conduct, policies, and so on in there when we start to talk about conflict. So it's, realistically probably not the sort of stuff that we're looking to deal with through the disaster resilience action planning template and resources through this first component of the education and training program and series from council. But what's great is that you've given us some pointers as to the sort of things that that organisations likely looking for some support with, Robin, so we can look to address that through future sessions. So thanks very much for the question. Any other questions? Anyone else that would like to ask a question verbally or pop a question in the chat? We might be ready to get an early mark, 7:54. Look, we're 6 minutes prior to the 8 o'clock hard finish time, which is fantastic. Sincere thanks again for coming along this evening and for taking part in your organisation's disaster resilience and disaster management planning. We look forward to any questions that might come into us. Faye, thanks again. I'll pass your question specifically. Well, like I say, the council team who are still online tonight have heard your question. I'll engage with them directly on that very promptly, and we'll make sure that someone comes back to you. And I really enjoy the opportunity to get in front of people who care about their organisation, their community, and their own volunteer role. So again, a sincere thanks to everyone for taking the time out of your Wednesday evening to join us tonight. And I look forward to seeing all of you again in future sessions. Looks like we've had a positive response to your question, Peter, regarding the online delivery. So thank you very much. And for future delivery, we'll certainly take that on notice. So thanks again, everyone. I'll leave this. Thanks, Pete. I'll leave the screen up there, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Sorry, Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just on behalf of Moreton Bay Council, thank you everyone for attending. As Steve noted, this is just really the first of a series of education and training workshops that we're going to be running over the next 2 years. And we look forward to seeing you all again. And if you do have any questions, please reach out via that Sport and Recreation email address. And we'll make sure we get back to you as soon as possible.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.